that's one of the core lessons that I think I've learned over the years is how important, um, good management is, not just senior management, but middle management as well. And I think that's something that when you look going lab to market, a lot of technical people really undervalue how important people are who are really good at hearing people and at organizing people, but aren't necessarily going to be people that are your mathematical or physical superstars. And we tend to undervalue people who are just middle managers. But in reality, that skill set, and it is a skill set that has to be trained, of understanding, how to communicate with, people, how to get them to set goals and understand how those goals link to the larger goals of the organization, how to make sure they have what they need and speak up for what they need and to take ownership of what they're doing. Man, finding good, strong, management early on is really a key to success in scaling a company from your first 5 people to 40 or 50 people.
Welcome to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast. Too many advanced science and engineering companies fail to deliver their innovations from the lab to the market. We are on a mission to change that. My name is Chris Reichhelm, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deep Tech Leaders. Each week, we speak with some of the world's leading entrepreneurs, investors, corporates, and policymakers about what it takes to succeed on the lab to market journey. Join us. Most entrepreneurs dream of getting their exit. Today's guest has had 2. And what's more, they've been in completely different sectors. How's that for unusual? His first was in energy. His second was in digital PCR and diagnostics, medical diagnostics. Today, I'm talking to Chris Perkins, an American entrepreneur who has a chemical engineering background and was able to build his first energy company, Copernican Energy, that he later sold to Sundrop Fuels, again out of Colorado, and his second as founder and CEO of Dropworks, a digital PCR medical diagnostics business that he sold to Bio-Rad for $125 million. How does one become a founder and CEO of a biofuels company and then a medical diagnostic company and have success, not be considered completely crazy, but actually had success and delivered real value? Either he is the luckiest guy in the world, or he has figured out a system of building these companies, of figuring out the right kinds of problems to solve, of guiding his development and engineering teams, of getting to a certain level of product market fit, becoming interesting enough where the market takes notice and has to acquire what he's got. This is what I want to figure out today. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get into it. Chris Perkins, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's great to be here, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
You've had 2 exits, one in energy and the other in medical diagnostics. And you've made very good money from each of these transactions. And that represents the goal for so many entrepreneurs in one way. It's not the whole goal, but it represents a goal for many. And you're still relatively young. And so as you reflect on your success, and it is success, how much do you attribute to luck? And how much do you attribute to something that you've figured out already that the rest of us are still grappling with?
Obviously, you have to attribute a lot to luck. Again, being in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people, having the right conversation at a conference, whether it be JPM or any of the other financing conferences. All of those things matter. But to get to the other side of the question, is there something that I've figured out that most other people are struggling with? I don't think so. I think it's more comes down to, is there something that I've been willing to accept which is that I don't know the answer going in, that my idea of what my company is, when I'm trying to start a company, isn't the idea I'm going to end up with. And that's something that we all kind of are feeling around, but I think a lot of founders get wedded to. I've got to have the best idea, and that's the idea I got to come up with that's going to, disrupt this market or save the world or have this huge impact. And instead say, wait, I'm in this to have an impact. I'm in this to solve somebody else's problem. And the only way to get there is to go talk to those people. And really, instead of talking to those people, listen to those people and be really curious about what are they dealing with every day? What are the problems they wake up and think about every day? And oftentimes those problems, you don't have anything to do with what the technology you have in your lab is and what it could solve. And then, you think about, well, is there something we could change that would help solve this problem? Or do I need to move on and find a different set of customers that might have something there's an overlap between problems they have and problems I can solve? And I think, this is not, some revelation coming down from the mountaintop. I mean, Steve Blank has been talking about this lean startup process for years. But I think it's tough to do because it really requires, something that people who are really ambitious and into starting startup companies, struggle with, which is they've always been the people who have had the answers, and now you have to let go of your ego a little bit and be really curious because the answers aren't, in your head. They belong to the people whose problems you're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get to that, then it gets to the whole underlying idea of why you're trying to start a startup. If you're trying to do it because you want to make a lot of money, there are easier ways to do that. Go get into finance or something. You're really into it because you want to have an impact. And then you start to think about, well, who am I serving? And, what kind of impact am I trying to have? And then you start to put the focus on other people and on listening. And that's where you uncover, what the problem is that you might be able to develop a solution for.
Is that a challenge? That's a great answer, by the way. Is that challenge greater for academics or for researchers or technology innovators, where the love of the technology and often, the birth of the company revolves around their development of an initial idea or a platform, which then often they try to back into as a solution to a problem?
Yeah, Chris, I think that's two. There's that the answer that is twofold. Yes, for these two reasons. The first is that the kind of questions that academics, ask, that are important to answer in academia, questions around how the world works from a basic level, are very different than the kind of questions you have to ask when you're trying to bring a product to market and find product market fit. You're less interested about fundamentally how a certain material works or, what's going on, in a biological system. You have to be interested in, well, why does this tool not work well for somebody in the life sciences? And what would change their day? What would change their lives on a day-to-day basis if it were different? And oftentimes that doesn't take a huge technological solution. It takes a little bit of additional technology, integration of a lot of existing technologies. And, oftentimes it's not as interesting for academics because of the way as academics were trained to think, and that doesn't mean that the questions that academics ask are any less valuable. That's why, we really want the government to pay for lots of research and to drive those things, because those basic science innovations form the foundations for what will eventually become technology companies. But those technology companies in the startup phase need to ask different kinds of questions. Questions around, what do market need? What is good enough? I think that is a really difficult question for academics to ask because, oftentimes they want to understand things at a much deeper level or a much more, interesting, scientific level than what is required to actually solve the problem. The second piece of this, and the reason why I think some academics struggle making that transition, is oftentimes they're people who have always been really strong individual contributors. And so they've always been the people whom everybody, from the moment they were in school, they were always the one leading the groups and solving the problems and coming up with the answers. And then now that has continued. They have developed a technology, with, in all capital letters. And it's difficult then when you get to the market and the market says, well, we don't need 99% of your technology. But there might be one thing that works. It's difficult for folks to let go of that idea and say, okay, well, I'm willing to put the rest of that on the shelf and go bring the piece to the market that is actually valuable to the people out there doing that. A good example of this was at Dropworks. Like at Dropworks, we had a technology that came out of Arizona State University. And the entire idea of this technology, when it was developed, it was a digital PCR technology that was fully automated. Like, to get a sample, to purify the sample, to then analyze the sample and deliver an answer, required no human input because it was designed to go on this miniature submarine and test, the bacteria out in the ocean. And when we started to look into the market for ocean-going bacterial analysis and assaying subs, it was a small market. But it turned out that there was a market for digital PCR tools where people were really frustrated with the workflow of what existed. There were some really groundbreaking technologies that come into the market and established that market, but now people wanted things to be as simple as what they were used to using with, the real-time PCR that preceded that. And so when we started to ask, it was we started to pull off pieces of the machine that had been developed, to the point where it was 10% of what it was. And had we not been able to do that, we wouldn't have been able to really pivot into the direction that the company ended up being required for, which was to solve a problem that most life science researchers would have. Versus this problem that there was very small slice and required a very complicated technical solution that was very creative, but didn't bring a lot of value. All of those automation steps only mattered to a small number of folks. And so being able to step away from that is something that I think a lot of academics struggle with because, they have imagined in their mind how valuable everything can be. To the world. And they're very good at convincing not just other people, but themselves of how valuable that can be.
How much of a challenge was that for you with Copernican Energy?
So Copernican Energy was, it's a good example of not knowing what you're getting into. I went to graduate school because I wanted to work on, the energy problem. In renewable energy. It was, 2001 when I was applying for grad school, started in 2002. And so I worked at hydrogen and, concentrated solar energy and biomass and a variety of things. We started that company because we thought we were going to change the world. We're going to make gasoline for everybody from solar energy and from biomass. And there was a lot of, I think, optimism behind that. What I would say we did wrong there is, first of all, we didn't talk to a single customer. We just looked up what the price of gasoline was, and it was a time of a lot of excitement. If you think back to 2008 when we got acquired, oil was at $140 a barrel. Natural gas was 4 or 5 times as expensive as it is now, and so there was a whole lot of enthusiasm for things moving into the space. I think one of the things, it was not hard for us to say, well, we should, do exactly this technology or versus this technology. But I think it was really hard for me transitioning from there into sun-drop fuels to let go of, some of the core pieces of the tech. And that transition for me as a going from a scientist to, because Copernican is a very small company. It's I was CTO, but I was really the only person doing technical work for a while. It was tough to then be managing people and realize I didn't have to be the one to come up with the solutions. I had to be the one to hire the people and empower the people to do that. And it didn't have to be the thing we had promised to the venture capitalists at the beginning, that we're going to use this kind of technology. In that case, it was like this concentrating solar system at very high temperatures that we could have pivoted into other spaces using pieces of our technology to get where we needed to be. And at some point, the image, the vision of what we were trying to do and the amount of money we had raised made it very difficult for us to turn that ship at all. It was like we were either going to become the Exxon of renewable energy, or we were going to, really struggle to get where we were going. And in the end, that's kind of what happened. But less out of a technical failure, even though we were trying to solve a huge number of technical challenges all at once, and more out of we had gotten wedded to a really huge vision, and those are difficult places for startup companies to be. I mean, when you're trying to invent new materials of construction at the same time that you're trying to solve how you get a huge amount of biomass into one space at one time, where you're trying to solve how you're going to get the market to accept this, and where you policy considerations all at once, that's a very tough place for a small company of 20, 40 people to be successful. And we had a lot of really smart, talented people working really, really hard. But one of the things I took from that was like, startup companies, really need to be focused on a problem that's achievable right in front of their faces, so that they can grow to get to a point that they can start to tackle those bigger problems.
Yeah, I get that. This switch in mindset that you talk about between academia and the love of that initial platform development, the focus on that because of the desire to understand the way the world works, the way particular materials work, the way a particular platform behaves, and the mindset required to go into a company where you may be required to pick that apart, to strip it down, and to rebuild it. Are we talking about two different people?
I think yes is the answer to that question. It can be a person, but that person's got to change over time to get to there. And oftentimes you see, a model where a postdoc or a graduate student of a PI in a lab is the person that goes on and takes that challenge forward, because the PI has got a lot of responsibilities and they're still interested in doing your university job. I think that model can work, provided that the person moving into the business side of things understands what they're getting into. I think a lot of times it is somebody commercializing their graduate research that they did under that PI, and then they still envision their job as being the core technical person, but then they also imagine themselves running this company. And I think there's a popular image of the startup founder as sort of this Tony Stark type person who's not just, really capable and really successful, but like the technical genius who's going to solve every problem in the world. And that is not how it works. And a lot of times when I mentor startup founders, and they want to be the CEO, but they also want to drive all the technology development. One of the questions I asked was like, imagine you're climbing a mountain. Are you the person on the summit day leading that summit team and getting to the top of the mountain? Or are you the person in base camp, organizing all of the supplies and, radioing up there and making sure, and oftentimes you'll hear they know the answer that they think you want, which is like base camp person. But they really want to be the person on the top of the mountain, which is okay, because they need to then realize that's who they are. If they don't want to let go of that technical piece, then let's go find somebody who understands how to do, I actually hate the words the business side of things. It's actually who understands how to run the search. How do you go and find out the idea? Because the real trick is the CEO isn't the base camp manager either. They're the person back in the home country who figured out which mountain you were supposed to climb and recruited the team and got all the supplies together. And you're really talking about a CTO when you're talking about the person in base camp, because they're not doing those day-to-day technical discoveries either. And, I had to remind myself of this, every time that, at Dropworks, we were a couple of people to start. And so, there were days as CEO that I was writing, microcontroller code, and I was, soldering electrical boards, and I was putting together tubing and things like that, because that's what you have to do sometimes for a short period of time when you're small and you don't have any money. But when we were 40 people, I had to remind myself when there was an interesting technical discussion going on in a room that they didn't need me. They need me to do that. They needed me to go find them more people to help, drive their technical, progress forward. And it's really hard when you're a scientist, to do that. Yeah. So, I think the core problem is having somebody who's coming out of academia ask themselves, what do they see themselves doing at the company that they envision starting? And if it is, I am going to develop the technology, that's great, but you need the rest of the team, and you need somebody in particular who's skilled at figuring out what problem you're going to solve. And that really just needs dropping your ego, and going and listening to people and being really curious about what their problems are. In the back of your mind, you understand what the technology can do and you're connecting the dots. But being able to do that is the most important skill in figuring and getting a startup off the ground. Everything else, raising money, recruiting a team, getting market traction, and then eventually getting to exit flows from that piece.
How did you guys handle that? How did you figure out that early phase? Because you're absolutely right. If you want to get on the right trajectory, you've got to solve for this early on. How did you guys figure it out? What were the lessons you learned through that process?
At Copernican, I did, and we got really lucky. What I did, after that is I called 40, 50 different customers within the first, 3 or 4 weeks in a space I knew really nothing about. It was like, I knew what DNA was, and that was about as far as anything I knew in the life sciences. So I had always been on the physical side. And people would ask, well, how did you get to know people so quickly? And I really think it was, I had some friends who were in that space. And so they made some introductions. But I just asked really naive questions. And when I would email people, I would take Steve Blank's advice, and make sure they know you're not selling them anything. You really want to understand their problem. I'm here to listen to you. And people really like to talk about their problems. And so it didn't take all that long, to start to get to know a few of the people, in the space that this could apply to. And I talked to environmental sampling people first, and that was sort of a dead end. And then I talked to folks in that food safety business, and understood that they had their problem was solved by a different method, and into industrial biotechnology, and finally into life science tools. With an initial idea that we're going to do diagnostics, and then we realized how challenging it would be to get out off the ground, and really just focused on research first. And as we talked to people there, we found not just research at large, but a couple of spaces that there was a core problem, that we could really focus on and solve a workflow problem, for gene therapy, and a cost problem for some of the high throughput applications there. And so the way we did that is I just cold emailed folks. And then after I, got a couple of conversations, I always would ask 2 questions at the end. The first is, what haven't I asked you that you think I should know? And then the second is, who should I talk to next? And on average, every touch point would yield two touch points. And so you can think of that branching out pretty quickly. And before we knew it, we knew a whole lot of people that had experience in the space, or that were working in the space we were working in. And I think that approach works no matter what, no matter what field you're in. I'm on the board of a company right now that's working in the pharmaceutical tools space, and they're doing the same thing. They have a bunch of customers, but they're reaching out and they're asking questions. We don't have anything to sell you, but right now we want to understand what your problem is, and then they can, pivot into understanding, do they have something there that they can sell to people.
Converting that insight that you're gathering from these calls and then converting that into activity within the business. Can you kind of walk us through what that meant at Dropworks? How did that impact what people were doing? And I guess the second question on top of that, what was the way of, what was the development methodology? Were you guys operating lean and agile? Can you do that in such an environment where it's so multidisciplinary, it's so precise? I mean, these sorts of tools are very, very precise. It's not, it's not software. So can you walk us through a little bit about the conversion of insight into activity and then the way you went about building out what I'm guessing were prototypes and maybe early pilots?
Yeah, I mean, your first step, when you start to hear what customer are telling you, you're getting all this relatively unstructured information, right? And you're trying to see where it overlaps to a specific need. That's got to translate into, a set of requirements for what is, in some of the lean startup parlance, the minimally viable product. What that really just means is like, this thing only needs these two things to be better. These two features. It's like if for us at Dropworks, it was everything had to be the same as the existing real-time PCR machines, and the workflow had to be same, which was different than in a digital PCR machine, which had like 3 or 4 more steps. So we had to get rid of those 3 or 4 steps. If we could do that, then we had a machine that would. And obviously, there are technical specifications that come out of that and all that. So it's developing, okay, what are the requirements of this thing, though? Because that's going to develop your effort. And then from there, you have to say, well, what are all the things we don't know right now that we need to know? Like, why can't we build it today? Why can't we just put a machine together right now? Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff we do. And the process of then solving those questions is really the process of development of the product. And to say, well, did we use a lean or an agile type development process? Yes, for parts of it. For parts of it, we wandered around in the dark a little bit and had to realize we didn't know enough about the boundaries of where the system worked and didn't work to move forward. And we had to go back and do a little bit of that work. I think there's a big tendency for people who are trying to start startup companies, and I fall into this bucket of saying like, good, it works, let's move forward, and not really taking a step back to say, okay, but where does it not work? And for us, we were generating these little droplets, and it was working great, and then all of a sudden, it wasn't working on any of the machines we were working on, and we were too willing to have a prototype that worked, and not willing enough to do a more structured engineering process around that early on to figure out, okay, well, where doesn't it work? What are the sizes that these specific things need to be? What are the materials we can or can't use? And you want to be careful that doesn't extend into an academic project where you're, over classifying or over, doing more science than you need to. It really comes down to defining those first questions really well. What do we need to know before we're able to move this product out into the market? And the effort then that you do stems around that. Now, what I would say is, for anybody, one of the key first hires then is somebody who's going to lead your organization's project management effort and lead your organization's technology development effort. And those can be separate roles or the same role depending on the kind of person that you get. But you need somebody who's used to building a structured a structured environment in which people have clear deliverables and they're held to those deliverables. And people work a lot better in those environments. They feel it sounds crazy, but given more constraints, people feel safer. They given more guidance, people feel like they know what they're supposed to do. That's the more positive way of saying that. But I think it's really tough for even really, really smart people to try to figure out what you want them to do or what they should do without strong organizational management. And Chris, that's one of the core lessons that I think I've learned over the years is how important um, good management is, not just senior management, but middle management as well. And I think that's something that when you look going lab to market, a lot of technical people really undervalue how important people are who are really good at hearing people and at organizing people, but aren't necessarily going to be people that are your mathematical or physical superstars. And we tend to undervalue people who are just middle managers. But in reality, that skill set, and it is a skill set that has to be trained, of understanding, how to communicate with, people, how to get them to set goals and understand how those goals link to the larger goals of the organization, how to make sure they have what they need and speak up for what they need and to take ownership of what they're doing. Man, finding good, strong, management early on is really the key to success in scaling a company from your first 5 people to 40 or 50 people. It amazed me because our strategy at the beginning of Dropworks was we are going to find the smartest people and we're going to let them guide us where it needs to go on each of the areas that they're in. And what we ended up with was a lot of unhappy, unproductive, smart people, and we had to learn, okay, some of these people can be empowered to be managers, but they have to then give up. They can be trained in that direction, but they have to give up some of the technical leadership that they want to do. So if that's a direction they want to move in, and we had, some people really successful in that space. And some of the other places we have to hire in people who are going to be strong technical managers. And that's a hard job to hire for, but really important. And we are really, on the road to continuing to transform our culture in a way that people felt, more like they understood where they were going and more like they knew what they were supposed to do day to day, which made them feel safer in the environment and thus overall more productive. And we forget that when you're 5 people or 6 people, you can talk to everybody in the company multiple times every day. When you're 20, 30, 40 people, all of a sudden that doesn't happen anymore. And that the importance of those middle management layers becomes stronger and stronger and stronger as you grow.
Were those hires you made, were they domain experienced hires?
Yes, but the ones where we had the most successes in 2 places, and I'm thinking both at Dropworks and at some Drop Tools. The places where we had the most success would be, first of all, yes, hiring somebody with some domain experience, but so that they could talk to the technical people and understand what they're going through, but who also had, a successful track record of being, one of these middle managers. The other place we had some success.
If you don't mind me interrupting there. If you don't mind me interrupting there real quick. So they had domain experience. Did they have previous startup experience? Or was it largely corporate experience or SME experience?
For the people who had, I think, the most success, it was in medium-sized companies, and where I startups are tough places for corporate folks out of large corporations, just because you don't have the support systems a lot, and you don't oftentimes have processes in place yet. You expect people to put those in place, but a lot of times you've only been in small startups. It's really a roll of the dice as to whether they had a leader that really valued that early stage, valued that middle management or that management as a skill. We had a lot of success at Dropworks, particularly in the second half of the company's existence, in identifying some of our younger subject area experts who had, an aptitude for leadership and putting them in those roles and then working to support those. And then I could think of, multiple people who ended up becoming really strong in that leadership space and have moved on to other things now where they continue to do that. And so you can do it a couple ways. The most important piece is that management as a skill has to be valued by the company. You have to invest in it. You have to support those people. So you have to look to hire it or you have to look to train it. It's going to cost money. It's going to slow you down. In the end, it's going to make you faster. And you're going to have a better culture when that happens.
We have this very negative association with management. And my hypothesis is it's one of the reasons why we don't have enough of these businesses actually scaling, because we don't have the systems and processes and people in place around which you can build a company capable of supporting the marketplace and whatever solution you're in. So to hear you talk about the importance of it and the importance of that as a lesson that you've picked up is actually really heartening.
Yeah, I mean, Chris, I think I have a hypothesis that we have such a bad association with management is because is a symptom of the way that a lot of those companies approach management. It's because we have a lot of bad managers because you promoted people into positions of management without supporting them. When you have companies that don't value management, the people that become managers don't have the support or the training or the focus to end up becoming good managers, and then thus the technical people in those organizations just end up thinking, well, management's really, really stupid, and that's a common that happens in lots of human organizations where the people at the top hold the responsibility up to them, the people at the bottom push the responsibility up, and both are participating in that exchange. And a startup company requires you to be really flexible in how you see yourself, what kind of role that you're filling. And I think most people, draw artificial walls around themselves. And I have myself at times, where it's like, well, I can't do that. I'm not a blank, or I can't look at computer code. I'm a biologist, and it's like, well, we don't have any biology tasks today, but today I need somebody to do this, or I need somebody to learn how to go talk to customers. And I know you're not a salesperson. We don't have any salespeople yet. What I need somebody to do is go out there and go find out this piece of information for me. And the people who are really successful, I think, in startup companies, particularly early in the first 40 people or so, are people who aren't just willing to wear a lot of hats, but are anxious to learn new things all the time. And again, that makes sense too, because you hope that out of the first 40 people you have a lot of the leaders that you want to carry on to the first 200 people. Right? You're looking for people who are going to lead groups, if not go into senior management positions, because you're not going to hire your C-suite that you're going to have through IPO, in the first, 3 weeks after your Series A round. That's not how that works. So you're looking to hope that the people that you have in that first 34 people are people you develop into positions, but they've got to change to get there.
Yeah. You are my last question for you, Chris, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this afternoon. You're advising a lot of young startups now, and you're sitting on boards and so on. What are the key pieces of advice you're giving to entrepreneurs as they set out on this journey?
I think, one of the things, the most common thing I get asked is, how do you raise money? I need to raise money. Look at my deck. Tell me what's going on. Tell me, or introduce me to these VCs, and that's the wrong focus. And oftentimes I see it right away when I look at the startup deck, because it's 20 pages, 30 pages of dense. We're going to tell you everything about everything we imagine this. The thing that I really try to align folks to is you need to understand your customer and their problem, so well that you can express it in a sentence or two. And I think a thing a lot of folks really struggle with, I struggle with this at Dropworks, was how do every customer is different, and how do I fit all the different applications I see into one slide to be able to let this VC or this potential customer know like how amazing this is going to be, so that they understand they should invest in me. And if you can't express it in a few, 1 to 2 sentences, maybe 3 at the most, short sentences, then you don't really understand it. You don't have a problem that's clear enough. And if that's not a problem that people are thinking about every day, it's going to be tough to drive traction, because they're not really going out of their way to solve it right now. It's got to be something that, the difference between what you should call an aspirin problem and an antibiotic problem. If you have a headache, you could use some aspirin, but if you don't get the aspirin, you're going to be okay. But if you have an infection, you need that antibiotic. And those are the kind of problems that startup companies should be looking to solve, which are immediate things that are going to see rapid uptake, and there has to be overlap with the area you want to impact personally. It's got to be in the field. Like, I'm sure there are really important, or really big problems in, some sort of accounting software, out there, but that's not a problem I have passion about. That's a problem somebody else might have passion about. And then the problem's got to be big enough that, in your initial beachhead application, it's going to be interesting to investors. And then you see the pathways to it. So I think a lot of founders come to me and they'll say, well, we want to be introduced to X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, okay, let me see your deck. Or they want help with their pitch deck, and they haven't figured out that first piece yet. And the funny thing about that is, once you know what that product is, what the problem is, and who the customer is, everything else flows out of that really easily. You have like a 9-slide pitch deck, and it's like, who's your customer and what's their problem is your first slide. What's the impact of solving the problem is your second slide. Your third slide is, how is it being solved now and why doesn't that work? Your fourth slide is, here's how we solve the problem. Your fifth slide's the one where you get to talk a little bit about your technology, but not in detail, just sort of at high level. The next slide is, what's your business model? The slide after that is what do your pro forma financials look like, which nobody believes in, right? But you have to have it there, so that you can at least show you've thought about this. You've showed what the market is, on slide 2, and now you're showing this. And then you want to talk about your team and what the exits look like. That's a deck, 9 slides. Give or take. And you want to work on, how can I put as few words as possible onto each one of those slides? Think in bullet points. But you can't do any of that effectively until you understand that customer's problem really effectively. Once you do, man, it gets so easy. And when you talk about exits, M&A, particularly to a strategic, it's the same problem. What's the problem that strategic is trying to solve, and how do you fit into it? So when you go through your management presentation, when you get inbound interest to be sold, it's the same kind of pitch. Well, here's this problem, that we're trying to solve, and you're thinking about it in terms of those customers are also the customers of the strategic, and you're just pitching the same way. A lot of times founders try to get married on the first contact with the VC, and you're trying to get to the second date. So I think that's, if I were to give advice, to sum things up, it's like at the top, you have to go talk to customers. You have to be, drop your ego, realize they have the answers, go be really, really curious, follow where, you have your own hypotheses, but be willing to cross those off. So that's number one. Number two, then as you scale your company, really invest in culture and management. Think about, you're running an organization. You're no longer one person doing a PhD project. Now you are And so an organization needs people to help organize. And then the last piece is, don't try to solve all of the world's problems with one startup. Solve a problem that's immediate, right in front of you. Doing that makes the startup successful and enables you to solve the next problem and the next problem and the next problem, and eventually get bigger. All of the big startup companies that we think of tackling really, really challenging problems today, massive scale problems, they did not start that way. They started solving small problems that made the money, that still overlapped with the impact they were trying to have, but and enabled them to move into bigger spaces so that they became large companies that then had the resources to tackle things that were much larger scale.
Amazing. That is valuable advice, Chris. Thank you so much.
Well, it was a hard learned, and I continue to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. But an environment in which there are no mistakes made is an environment in which there isn't any learning happening. And so,
absolutely,
hopefully,
absolutely.
So I hope to continue to make mistakes in the future and learn from those and keep getting better at this. And hopefully, I can be of some help to the people that I'm working with right now.
I'm sure you are. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on the program. It's been a pleasure having you.
Same here, Chris. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Lab to Market Leadership Podcast, brought to you by Deep Tech Leaders. This podcast has been produced by Bauhaus. You can find out more about us on LinkedIn, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.